Before we begin tonight, I want you to think about something that most people never really consider when they walk into the woods. The forest always looks peaceful during the day. Sunlight through the trees, wind in the leaves, birds singing somewhere in the distance. It gives you the illusion that nature is calm, harmless even. But when night falls, the forest becomes something else entirely. The sounds change, the shadows deepen, and sometimes the things moving between those trees are not animals at all. Welcome back to True Haunting Log, a podcast where real people share the most terrifying encounters of their lives. These are not fictional horror stories. These are experiences submitted by people who swear what they saw was real, even if they still cannot explain it. If you have your own encounter with something strange, something paranormal, or something that followed you home, you can submit your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. Your story might appear in a future episode. Tonight's first encounter was submitted by Daniel, and it happened during what was supposed to be a simple church mission trip. Story 1, The Bloody Skinwalker, submitted by Daniel. This was the most horrifying experience of my life. At the time, I was 14 years old. I know that probably sounds young, but I wasn't a little kid. I was already tall for my age, around 5'11", and I had always been obsessed with horror, ghost stories, demon encounters, urban legends. I read everything I could find. Because of that, people always assumed I wasn't easily scared. But what happened on that trip changed the way I look at the woods forever. I was on a missionary trip to Mexico with my church group. There were about 15 of us, mostly teenagers and a few adult leaders. We were supposed to stay for 10 days helping a small village outside a rural area. During the day, we helped repair homes, delivered supplies, and spent time talking with the locals. At night, we would rest at a small camp set up near the edge of the forest. Sometimes the older natives would sit with us near the fire and tell stories. Not just stories about their beliefs or their traditions, but stories about the land itself. Stories about things that lived in the mountains and forests nearby. At first, most of us listened politely, but didn't really take it seriously. It felt like folklore, the kind of stories people tell to scare kids away from wandering too far from home. But on the 6th night, one of the elders told a story that stuck with me. He talked about a creature called Ye Naldlushi. The way he spoke about it was different from the other stories. He didn't smile. He didn't dramatize anything. If anything, he seemed uncomfortable even saying the name. He said it was something that could change its shape, something that could become animals, or even mimic people. He said it lived deep in the wilderness and sometimes followed travelers who wandered too far from safe paths. But what scared me the most wasn't the description of the creature. It was the warning he gave afterward. He told us clearly that saying the name could attract it, and he told us never to say it. When the story ended, the old man actually blessed us before leaving the fire. At the time, my friend Eric and I thought it was dramatic. Eric was the kind of person who didn't scare easily. He liked pushing boundaries and joking about things people took seriously. Later that evening, we were talking to one of our missionary leaders about the stories we had heard. And like idiots, we said the name, not once, twice. At the time, it felt harmless, just a word from a creepy campfire story. But something about the atmosphere that night felt different afterward. The air seemed heavier. The forest around the camp felt strangely quiet. Looking back now, I wish we had listened to the warning. A few hours later, Eric and I decided to sneak out of the camp. We had been drinking energy drinks and coffee earlier in the evening trying to stay awake, so we were wide awake while everyone else was asleep. We were bored, restless, and curious. And boredom is dangerous when you're a teenager in the middle of nowhere. There was a narrow trail the locals called Creep. Apparently it led deep into the forest beyond the areas most villagers traveled. Eric thought exploring it would be fun. I agreed. At first the walk felt exciting. The moon was bright enough to light the path, and the forest smelled like damp earth and pine. The trail twisted between tall trees, disappearing into darkness ahead of us. But about 10 minutes into the walk, something changed. I noticed a smell, rotten milk, but worse, much worse. It was thick and sour, the kind of smell that makes your stomach tighten immediately, like something had been dead nearby for days. Eric noticed it too. He wrinkled his nose and asked if I smelled it. I nodded, but we kept walking anyway. That was the moment everything started going wrong. Because a few minutes later, we heard footsteps behind us. At first it was just one sound, a heavy step pressing into leaves somewhere behind us. Then another, slow, deliberate. Eric stopped walking immediately, so did I, and the footsteps stopped too. For a moment we just stood there in the middle of the trail, staring back into the darkness between the trees. The moonlight barely reached the forest floor. Most of what we saw were shadows layered over more shadows. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered. I nodded slowly, but neither of us laughed about it. And that's when I realized we were both genuinely scared. Because normally Eric would have made a joke. Normally he would have tried to break the tension. But this time, he didn't. And that was the moment we realized something was following us. For a few seconds, Eric and I just stood there on the trail, staring back into the forest behind us. The darkness between the trees felt thicker than it had before, like the night itself had deepened somehow. I tried to listen carefully, hoping I would hear something normal, a deer stepping through leaves, a raccoon climbing a branch, something that would make the situation make sense, but the forest stayed completely silent. That silence felt wrong, because forests are never truly quiet. There's always something moving, wind through branches, insects buzzing somewhere in the undergrowth, birds shifting in the trees. But at that moment, none of those sounds were there. It was just us and the darkness. Eric finally whispered, "It's probably an animal." I nodded, even though I wasn't convinced. Saying that out loud felt like the only way to calm the sudden tension that had settled over us. "Yeah," I said quietly. Probably neither of us believed it, but neither of us wanted to admit that either. We turned around and started walking back the way we had come. At first, we moved slowly, trying not to make too much noise on the trail. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something standing there between the trees. But there was nothing, just shadows. After a minute or so, I started to relax slightly. Maybe we really had just startled some animal hiding nearby. Maybe it had already run off deeper into the forest. The smell was still there, though. That sour, rotten smell. And it seemed stronger now. Then the footsteps started again. The sound came from directly behind us. One step, then another, heavy enough that I could hear the leaves crunching clearly. Eric grabbed my arm immediately. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. This time there was no pretending we hadn't heard it. We both stopped walking again, and once again, the footsteps stopped too. The realization hit me almost instantly. Whatever was behind us wasn't just moving through the forest randomly. It was matching our movements. Eric looked back into the darkness again. "Hello?" he called out quietly. His voice sounded small against the silence of the trees. No one answered. Nothing moved. The smell hit me again then, stronger than before. It made my stomach twist slightly. The air felt thick with it now, like the source of the smell had moved much closer to us. And that's when the feeling started. That deep instinctive feeling that something nearby didn't belong. The kind of feeling that makes your heart start beating faster, even if you don't know why. The kind of feeling that tells you it's time to leave. Now. Eric must have felt it too. "Let's just go back," he said quickly. I nodded. It sounded like the smartest decision we had made all night. We turned around and started walking faster down the trail toward the camp. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal again, just the sound of our footsteps on the dirt path. Then the footsteps behind us started moving too. Only this time, they were closer. Much closer. The sound wasn't distant anymore. It sounded like whatever was following us was only a few steps behind. Eric turned his head slightly. "Don't look," I said quickly. I didn't know why I said that, but something inside me didn't want to see what was behind us yet, not until we absolutely had to. We both started walking faster. The footsteps matched our pace perfectly. We walked faster. The footsteps got faster. At that point, the fear was starting to build in my chest. The smell was overwhelming now, rotten and metallic at the same time. It almost burned my nose when I breathed. And the footsteps were right behind us, close enough that I could almost feel the presence of something large moving through the darkness. Eric finally said what both of us were thinking: "Run." And we did. We took off down the trail as fast as we could. Branches whipped against our arms as we pushed through the trees. The dirt path twisted through the forest, barely visible in the moonlight. I could hear Eric breathing hard beside me as we ran. Behind us, something crashed through the forest. Whatever had been walking quietly before was no longer trying to hide. Branches snapped, leaves scattered. Heavy footsteps pounded against the ground, and the sound was getting closer. I could feel adrenaline flooding through my body now. My legs were moving faster than they ever had before. All I could think about was getting back to the camp, back to the lights, back to where other people were. But the thing behind us kept gaining ground, and the smell was almost unbearable now. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped again, completely. The forest fell silent. The only sound left was our breathing as we slowed down. Eric glanced back over his shoulder. "What happened?" he whispered. I didn't answer, because something felt even worse now than it had before: the silence. We took a few more steps down the trail. Then I turned to say something to Eric, and that's when I walked directly into something standing in the middle of the path. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs instantly. Whatever I had hit felt solid, hot, almost burning to the touch. I stumbled backward and looked up, higher, higher. And that was when I saw it. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what had just happened. When you run into something in the dark, your mind usually tries to fill in the blanks with something normal. A tree branch, another person, maybe even one of your friends stepping into your path. But the thing I had just run into wasn't normal, not even close. I felt the heat of its body before I even saw it clearly. The air around it felt strangely warm, almost like standing too close to a fire. That was the first detail that made my stomach drop, because nothing in the forest should feel like that at night. I stumbled backward a few steps and forced myself to look up, higher, higher, until I finally saw its face, and the moment I did, every thought in my head disappeared. The creature standing in front of us was enormous. I was already tall for my age, nearly 6 feet, but this thing towered over me easily. Its head had to be at least 7 feet above the ground, maybe more. At first, my brain tried convincing me it was some kind of bear. That was the closest explanation I could find. But the longer I stared at it, the more I realized that comparison didn't fit. Its body looked wrong, too tall, too long, like its limbs had been stretched farther than they were supposed to be. Dark brown fur covered most of its body, but the fur wasn't clean. Something thick and wet clung to it, especially around its chest and shoulders. For a moment, I thought it was mud. Then the smell hit me again, stronger than ever. Blood. Fresh blood. The rotten smell we had been following through the forest suddenly made sense. It wasn't rot at all. It was the metallic, sour scent of blood soaking into fur. Eric had stopped moving behind me. I could hear his breathing, fast and uneven. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. We just stared at the creature standing in the middle of the trail. The thing tilted its head slowly. The movement was strangely curious, almost thoughtful, like it was examining us. and that was when I noticed its eyes, dull yellow, not glowing, not shining, just staring. There was something deeply unsettling about those eyes. They didn't look like the eyes of a normal animal. They looked aware of us, aware of what we were. Then the creature opened its mouth. For a moment, I thought it might speak. Instead, it screamed. The sound that came out of its throat was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It started like a wolf's howl, deep and echoing through the trees. But layered inside that howl was another sound entirely. A harsh, buzzing noise, like a broken television filled with static. The two sounds merged together into something that made my skin crawl instantly. Birds burst from nearby branches as the scream echoed through the forest. And suddenly, the paralysis that had frozen both Eric and me in place shattered. "Run!" I shouted. That was all it took. Eric turned and sprinted down the trail without hesitation. I grabbed his arm and ran with him, pulling him forward as we pushed ourselves as fast as our legs would go. Branches snapped against our arms as we tore through the forest. The narrow path twisted between trees, barely visible in the dim moonlight. Behind us, something crashed through the woods. The creature was moving now, and it was fast, far too fast for something that size. Heavy footsteps pounded into the dirt behind us. Branches broke and scattered as the thing forced its way through the trees. Eric kept glancing over his shoulder. Every time he did, his breathing got more frantic. "Don't look back," I yelled. "Just run." But honestly, part of me wanted to look too, because something about the way the creature was chasing us didn't feel normal. It didn't feel like a predator hunting prey. It felt like something else entirely, like it was enjoying the chase. The trail curved through the forest again, and for a moment, I caught a faint glow ahead of us through the trees. The camp. Relief slammed into me so hard it almost made my legs buckle. "Almost there," I shouted to Eric. We pushed ourselves even harder, sprinting toward the lights of the camp clearing. The sounds of the creature crashing through the forest behind us were still getting closer. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, the sounds suddenly stopped. Completely. The silence that followed felt almost heavier than the noise had been. Eric and I slowed down instinctively as we stumbled into the open area where the tents were set up. Everyone else was asleep. The camp was quiet, peaceful, completely unaware of what had just happened. I turned around slowly. Part of me didn't want to look, but something told me I had to. Standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us, was not the creature we had seen on the trail. It was a coyote. But it was the largest coyote I had ever seen, and it was staring directly at me. For a moment, my brain tried desperately to convince me that everything we had just experienced had been some kind of mistake. Maybe fear had distorted what we saw. Maybe the creature on the trail had been a bear after all, and this coyote was just an animal that happened to wander out of the forest afterward. That explanation lasted about 2 seconds, because the coyote didn't move like a normal animal. It stood there at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still, its body half hidden in shadow. The moonlight from the clearing barely reached the forest behind it, but it was enough to illuminate the outline of its head and shoulders. And the way it was staring at me made my chest tighten immediately, not like a predator sizing up prey, not like a frightened animal trying to decide whether to run. It looked deliberate, focused, like it knew exactly who it was looking at. Eric was still breathing hard beside me, bent over slightly with his hands on his knees. He followed my gaze toward the forest edge. "What is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer, because the moment he asked that question, the coyote moved. The movement was slow at first, almost casual. The animal shifted its weight slightly, its paws pressing deeper into the dirt near the tree line. Then something happened that made my stomach drop instantly. The coyote lifted its front legs off the ground. Slowly, deliberately, until it was standing upright on 2 legs. Animals don't stand like that, not like this. The posture wasn't awkward or unstable like a dog begging for food. The creature balanced itself easily, almost comfortably, like standing upright was natural for it. And as it rose higher into the moonlight, I heard the first crack. The sound was quiet at first, like a dry twig snapping somewhere in the distance. Then another crack followed, and another. Within seconds, the forest was filled with the sound of bones shifting and snapping. The creature's body began to twist. Its spine bent in ways that made my stomach churn. Its shoulders rolled backward as if something underneath the skin was forcing them into a different position. Eric grabbed my sleeve tightly. "What is happening?" he whispered. I didn't respond, because I was too focused on the sound. The sound of bones grinding against each other is something you never forget once you hear it. It didn't sound clean like breaking wood. It sounded wet, heavy, like joints being forced into positions they were never meant to reach. The creature's body arched backwards suddenly, its silhouette twisting in the moonlight. For a moment, its shape looked completely wrong, too many angles bending at once. Then its front legs dropped back down to the ground, but it wasn't a coyote anymore. The animal standing there now was much larger. Its body looked heavier, thicker, built with dense muscle that rippled under its skin. Its shoulders were high and powerful, its back sloping downward toward long hind legs. Even in the dim light, I could see that it resembled something closer to a jaguar. But the proportions were wrong again. The limbs were too long, the torso too tall. And when it lifted its head slightly, I saw its eyes. The same dull yellow eyes that had stared at me on the trail. The same eyes that had looked directly into mine just minutes earlier. That was when the truth finally hit me. The coyote hadn't replaced the creature we saw in the forest. It was the creature. Something capable of changing its shape. Something capable of becoming different animals whenever it wanted. The old man's warning echoed through my head again. Never say its name, because speaking the name might attract it. For a moment, the creature simply stood there, watching us. Not Eric, not the camp, just me. Its head tilted slightly, the same curious motion I had seen earlier on the trail, like it was studying me, like it remembered something about me. That thought made my stomach twist even harder, because it meant something terrifying. The creature hadn't chased us out of the forest randomly. It had followed us, deliberately. For a second, I thought it might step out of the tree line and enter the clearing. If it had done that, I don't know what would have happened. The camp was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. No one would have known what was happening until it was too late. But instead, the creature turned away. Its massive body shifted slowly as it faced deeper into the forest. Then it moved, one step, then another. Within seconds, the darkness swallowed its shape completely, and just like that, it was gone. Eric and I stood there for a long time after that. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us moved. We just stared at the empty tree line where the creature had disappeared. Eventually, Eric whispered something quietly. Did that really just happen? I nodded slowly. But neither of us tried explaining what we had seen, because there was no explanation. We backed slowly toward our tents without taking our eyes off the forest. Every shadow between those trees looked dangerous now. Every rustle of leaves made my heart jump, but the creature never came back that night. For a long time, Eric and I just stood there staring at the tree line where the creature had disappeared. The forest looked normal again. The trees were still. The moonlight fell across the clearing the same way it had all night. But the feeling in my chest refused to calm down, because once you see something that shouldn't exist, the world never quite looks the same afterward. Eric finally broke the silence. "What was that?" he whispered. His voice sounded shaky in a way I had never heard before. Eric was usually the confident one, the guy who laughed things off and made jokes about scary stories. But now, he looked just as terrified as I felt. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because every explanation that entered my mind sounded ridiculous. Bear, dog, wild animal. None of those explanations included animals that could stand upright and break their own bones to change shape. So instead, I just said quietly, "I don't know," and that was the most honest answer I could give. Eventually, we backed slowly toward our tents. Neither of us wanted to turn our backs on the forest. It felt like the moment we did, something might step out of the darkness again. The camp itself looked peaceful. A few dim lanterns glowed near the center where our leaders had left them burning overnight. The tents were silent, everyone inside asleep. It was strange seeing something so normal after what had just happened. Almost like the world outside the forest had no idea anything was wrong. Eric crawled into his tent without saying another word. I did the same. But sleep never came, not even close. I lay there staring at the thin fabric wall of the tent, listening to every sound outside. The wind moving through the trees, the faint rustle of branches shifting somewhere deeper in the forest. Every tiny noise made my heart jump. Because all I could think about was how little separated me from that thing now. Just a thin layer of fabric and a line of trees. At one point, I even thought I heard footsteps again, heavy ones, moving slowly somewhere beyond the camp. I held my breath and listened carefully, but after a few seconds the sound faded away. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe it had been my imagination. Or maybe it had been something walking through the forest again. That thought kept me awake for the rest of the night. Morning eventually came, and with it the normal sounds of the forest returning. Birds chirping, insects buzzing in the grass. The sunlight filtering through the trees made everything look harmless again. If someone had walked into the clearing that morning, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just a group of teenagers waking up for another day of missionary work. Eric and I never told anyone what we saw, not the church leaders, not the other kids, not even our parents after we got home. Part of the reason was that we didn't think anyone would believe us. But the bigger reason was something else entirely. Neither of us wanted to say that name again. Because the old man's warning echoed in my mind every time I thought about it. Never say its name, because speaking it might attract it. The rest of the trip passed quietly. Nothing strange happened during the final 4 days. No footsteps in the woods. No strange smells drifting through the camp. No glowing yellow eyes watching from the tree line. But even though the forest looked peaceful again, I never trusted it the same way. Whenever we walked near the trees, I found myself scanning the shadows automatically, looking for movement, listening for footsteps that didn't belong. By the time the 10th day arrived and we packed our bags to return home, I felt a strange sense of relief, like leaving that place meant leaving the creature behind as well. But the truth is, the memory never left. Even now, years later, I still think about that night whenever I see a dark forest. Because the woods aren't empty, not really. There are things out there that don't belong to the world we understand. Things that can watch you without being seen. Things that can change their shape. Things that might follow you just to see what you'll do. And the worst part is knowing this. That creature didn't attack us. It didn't chase us all the way into the camp. It simply watched us leave. Almost like it had already gotten what it wanted. The forest can hide many things. Some of them are animals. Some of them are people. And sometimes they are something else entirely. And the next story proves just how terrifying those encounters can become. Because sometimes the thing hiding in the woods doesn't just watch you. Sometimes it tries to become you. Story 2. Encounter with a Skinwalker. The thing about terrifying encounters is that they almost never begin in terrifying ways. Most of the time they start with something completely normal, something so ordinary that if someone told you how the night would end, you probably wouldn't believe them. A camping trip, a walk through the woods, or in this case, a game. This story was submitted anonymously, and it happened about 4 years ago during a summer night that was supposed to be nothing more than a group of friends messing around on their property. But sometimes the woods around your home are not as empty as you think they are. This event happened about 4 years ago. It was a warm summer night, and my friends and I were outside playing a game of Nerf war on my family's property. The land we owned was about 5.5 acres, and most of it was surrounded by forest. At the time, it felt like the perfect place for a game like that. There were trees everywhere, tall grass, shadows to hide in, and plenty of places to sneak around without being seen. It was already dark by the time the game started getting intense. The moon was bright enough to light the property just enough that we could see shapes moving between the trees. But the darkness still left plenty of places to hide, which made the game even more fun. At least, that's what we thought at the time. Looking back now, I wish we had stayed closer to the house. I was hiding behind a tree near the edge of the woods. In one hand, I had 2 Nerf swords we were using for close combat, and in my back pocket, I had a small one-shot Nerf pistol. Somewhere in front of me, I could hear Daniel firing his automatic Nerf gun. The motor inside the toy made that buzzing sound every time he pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the trees as foam darts flew past branches. I crouched lower behind the tree and leaned slightly to the side, trying to see him through the branches without revealing my position. But the forest was darker than I expected. Most of what I saw were just moving shadows. Then I heard something else move behind me. At first, it sounded like leaves shifting under someone's foot, just one soft crunch, but that didn't make sense. Daniel was in front of me. Andrew was somewhere farther away on the other side of the property. So if someone was behind me, who was it? My first thought was that Andrew had somehow circled around and snuck up on me, so I spun around quickly, expecting to see him pointing his Nerf gun at my back. But no one was there, just darkness between the trees. I stood there for a moment, listening carefully. The only sound I could hear was Daniel's Nerf gun still firing somewhere ahead of me. Then, the movement happened again, closer this time. Something was moving slowly through the trees behind me. Branches shifted softly as whatever it was pushed through them. That's when I felt something change inside my chest. That strange instinctive feeling you get when something nearby doesn't belong. The kind of feeling that makes the back of your neck prickle, even if you can't explain why. I stepped out from behind the tree and raised my hand toward Daniel, signaling him to stop shooting. He noticed immediately and released the trigger on the Nerf gun. The buzzing motor fell silent. And suddenly the forest was quiet again, too quiet. Daniel walked toward me slowly. "What is it?" he whispered. I pointed behind me toward the trees. I heard something. He frowned and listened carefully for a moment. At first, nothing happened. Then both of us heard it. Movement, slow, deliberate. Something shifting through the forest somewhere behind the tree line. Daniel whispered, "Probably Andrew." But the way the sound moved didn't feel like Andrew. Andrew wasn't exactly subtle when he ran around the woods. He usually stomped through leaves like a bulldozer. The sound was quieter, almost careful. "Go get Andrew," I told Daniel quietly. He nodded and disappeared between the trees to find him. Meanwhile, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small knife I always carried with me. It wasn't a big knife, just a folding pocket knife. But holding it made me feel a little less exposed standing there alone. The movement in the trees continued, soft, scraping sounds, like something dragging its claws across bark. After a moment, I realized something strange. The sound wasn't moving away, it was moving around something, specifically around the large pine tree standing about 20 feet away from me. The tree was taller than most of the others nearby, with thick branches stretching high above the forest floor, and whatever was making that scratching sound seemed to be on the other side of it. By the time Daniel returned with Andrew, the sound was louder. Both of them noticed the knife in my hand immediately. Without asking questions, they pulled out their own knives too. All three of us slowly approached the large pine tree together. None of us spoke. The scratching sound continued on the other side of the trunk. Then Daniel stopped walking. Andrew stopped too. Both of them were staring upward. I followed their gaze, and the moment I saw what they were looking at, my stomach dropped. High in the branches of the pine tree, something was crouched there. Something tall, something thin, something that absolutely should not have been there. For a moment, my brain couldn't even understand what I was looking at. When you glance up into a tree at night, your mind expects to see branches, leaves, maybe a raccoon or an owl perched somewhere high above. But what I saw in that tree was neither of those things. It was something crouched along one of the thick upper branches, gripping the bark with long fingers that curved like claws. The shape alone made my stomach tighten because it was too big. Much too big. Even from the ground, I could tell the creature had to be close to 7 feet tall if it stood upright. Its body was extremely thin, almost skeletal, like it had been starved for years. Its limbs looked too long for its body, stretched out in a way that made its silhouette look unnatural against the moonlight. There was fur on its arms and legs, but the rest of its body looked bare. The skin that showed between the patches of fur looked pale and stretched tight across bone. For several seconds, the three of us just stood there, staring up at it. None of us spoke. None of us moved. The creature seemed completely focused on the tree branch it was gripping. It was scratching at the bark slowly, almost methodically, like it was trying to pry something loose from the wood. The sound of its claws dragging against the tree echoed softly through the forest. That scraping noise was the same sound I had heard earlier from the other side of the trunk. For a moment, I actually wondered if the thing had even noticed us yet. Its head was angled slightly away from us, and its focus seemed entirely on whatever it was doing to the tree. The three of us stood there frozen, hoping maybe we could back away quietly before it realized we were there. Then, a bird chirped somewhere in the forest. The sound cut through the silence sharply. The creature stopped scratching immediately. Slowly, its head turned toward the direction where the bird had chirped. The motion was slow and stiff, like its neck joints were grinding against each other as it moved. Then the creature opened its mouth and perfectly mimicked the sound of the bird, the same chirp, the exact same pitch, the exact same rhythm. But there was something wrong with it. The sound came out distorted, like hearing the call echo through a long tunnel. The noise carried through the trees in a way that made my skin crawl. It sounded almost right, but not quite. That was the moment I gasped, not loudly, but loud enough. And the instant the sound left my mouth, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The creature's head snapped toward us. Its eyes locked directly onto where we were standing beneath the tree. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see those eyes clearly, dark, focused, alert. The three of us immediately pressed ourselves against the base of the tree trunk, trying to hide behind it. My knife slipped from my hand and landed quietly in the dirt, but I didn't even think about picking it up. At that moment, all I cared about was not being seen. For a few seconds, the creature stayed completely still above us. Then it began to move. Slowly at first, its long limbs shifted along the branch as it crawled downward toward the trunk. The bark creaked under its weight as it climbed. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could hear Daniel and Andrew breathing beside me, both of them trying desperately to stay quiet. The creature's claws scraped against the tree as it descended. Then we heard something else. Its breathing. Heavy, wet, close. The creature reached the opposite side of the tree trunk from where we were hiding. For a moment, everything went silent again. And then, a voice spoke from the other side of the tree. "Where are you?" The voice sounded distorted, stretched, like the sound was being forced through a throat that didn't quite understand how human speech worked. But there was no mistaking whose voice it was imitating. It was mine. Exactly mine. The same tone, the same rhythm, the same sound. And hearing my own voice come from something standing on the other side of that tree was one of the most terrifying things I have ever experienced in my life. For a moment, none of us moved. Hearing my own voice come from the other side of that tree completely froze my body. It wasn't just similar to my voice. It was my voice. The exact same tone, the same rhythm, the same way I would normally speak. But there was something wrong with the way it sounded. The words felt stretched, distorted, like they had been pulled through something that didn't quite understand how human speech worked. "Where are you?" the voice said again. And once again, it sounded exactly like me. In that moment, I realized something that made my chest tighten with fear. The creature hadn't just been mimicking birds. It had been listening to us the entire time, learning the sounds we made, learning how we spoke. Daniel and Andrew pressed themselves harder against the tree trunk beside me. I could feel both of them shaking slightly. None of us dared to answer the voice. The creature moved slowly on the other side of the trunk. I could hear its claws scraping softly against the bark as it shifted its position. My eyes scanned the ground desperately, searching for some kind of escape route, but the forest around us suddenly felt much darker than it had a few minutes ago. If we ran now, the creature would see us instantly. And the way it had moved in the tree made it clear that it was much faster than any of us. My gaze finally landed on something lying in the dirt just a few feet in front of me. My knife, the one I had dropped when we pressed ourselves against the tree. The blade was partially buried in the pine needles, glinting faintly in the moonlight. For a moment I stared at it, trying to decide if grabbing it was worth the risk, because the moment I moved, the creature might notice. But another thought hit me just as quickly. If we didn't do something soon, the creature would eventually walk around the tree and find us anyway. The distorted voice came again. "Where are you?" Hearing my own voice stretched into those unnatural pauses made my skin crawl. The creature was moving again now, slowly circling the trunk of the tree. I could hear its claws scraping against bark only a few feet away. That was when I made a decision. If I was going to die out there, at least my friends would have a chance to run. I lunged forward toward the knife. My hand closed around the handle, and I spun around the trunk of the tree as fast as I could. But the moment I did, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. Standing directly in front of me was myself. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The creature had taken on my shape, same height, same clothes, same face staring back at me in the moonlight. But something about the copy was deeply wrong. The posture looked stiff and unnatural, like a puppet trying to imitate the way a human stands, and the expression on its face was completely blank. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I screamed and thrust the knife forward as hard as I could. The blade sliced through empty air. The creature had already moved. It stumbled backwards several feet with incredible speed, almost like it had teleported rather than stepped away. Then it screamed. The sound exploded through the forest like nothing I had ever heard before. It wasn't just loud, it was painful, like a mixture of animal howls, human screams, and something metallic grinding together. Daniel and Andrew both jumped backward as the creature twisted violently. Then it turned and dashed into the forest. Its long limbs carried it through the trees with terrifying speed. Branches snapped and leaves scattered as it disappeared deeper into the woods. Within seconds, it was gone. The three of us stood there in silence for a long time after that. None of us spoke. None of us moved. The forest around us had returned to its normal nighttime sounds, but everything felt different now. Eventually, Daniel picked up his knife and looked at me. "What was that?" he asked quietly. I shook my head slowly. "I don't know, and honestly, I still don't." We gathered the rest of our Nerf gear quickly and walked back toward the house without saying much. No one wanted to stay in the woods any longer than we had to. When I got inside, I told my parents what had happened. My dad went outside later that night and searched around the property with a flashlight, but he didn't find anything. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. And I never saw that creature again. But even now, every time I walk through the woods at night, I can't shake the feeling that something might still be out there, listening, learning, waiting for someone else to wander too close. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing about the forest is realizing that something in it knows exactly what you sound like and might decide to use your own voice to call you back into the dark. And that brings us to the end of tonight's episode of True Haunting Log. Stories like these remind us that the world is a lot stranger than we like to believe. Out there, beyond the safety of our homes and streetlights, there are places where things happen that simply cannot be explained. Maybe it's something watching from deep in the woods. Maybe it's something hiding just beyond the reach of the firelight. Or maybe it's something that has been following you all along. If you have experienced something strange, something terrifying, or something that you still can't explain to this day, I would love to hear your story. You can send your true horror experiences to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. Your story might be featured in a future episode of True Haunting Log. And if you enjoyed tonight's episode, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who loves horror, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true encounter. Because here on True Haunting Log, the stories you hear aren't just made up. They're told by the people who live through them. And until next time, lock your doors, check the shadows, and remember, some things in the dark are listening